Hello, and thanks for watching this Life Solved short. I'm John Worsey, and in these videos we get to meet the University of Portsmouth researchers who are featured on this series of the Life Solved podcast. Their work is changing the world for the better in all sorts of ways. Now, in one of our earliest episodes of Life Solved back in 2020, we spoke to Dr. Joe Preston about an amazing project to restore the native oyster along the Portsmouth coast. We heard about how reintroducing the oyster wasn't just about restoring a population on the brink, but also going some way towards cleaning up our waters. Now, I'm delighted today that Jo is back to talk about some exciting developments in that work, and she's brought with her a colleague, Professor Gordon Watson. Jo and Gordon, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Very lovely to be here again. Thank you.
So, Jo, in fact, since you last were here, you've had some exciting news. You've been promoted to Professor. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
And actually, it would be really interesting, before we dig into the work that you're both doing, I'd love to go back and have a look at what inspired you on this journey to become researchers and what interested you in marine biology in the first place. So maybe we'll start with you, Jo.
Yeah, of course. So as a child, I was obsessed about nature, one of those weird children that collected spiders and snails and drew things out there. Grew up by the sea, was born in Gosport, but I've always felt a really strong connection with the natural world and a really strong connection with the sea for whatever reason. And when I finally got to do marine biology, my master's, I went out to Malaysia, and it was 1997. It was an El Nino year, and I saw coral bleaching happen before my eyes, in front of my eyes, for the first time it was ever recorded.
And what does that look like for someone who's not familiar with coral bleaching?
So I was diving these coral reefs. They were quite pristine. Sometimes I had fishing nets all over them, ghost fishing nets. We went back and we started seeing patches of corals going from colourful organisms to this white bleached stone as the zooxanthellae was bleached out. And then over the 3 months I was there doing research, I saw these waves of bleaching just move across the reefs. And it was at that point, I mean, I loved the science, I love biology, I love nature, but at that point I decided I was going to spend the rest of my life working in marine conservation and looking at how my science can help inform policy and protection of the marine environment.
And you certainly are, which is what we're going to talk about today. Thanks, Jo. That's really interesting. How about you, Gordon?
Well, I come from nowhere near the sea. So I come from a place called Bedford, which is about 80 miles from any coast in the middle of England. But what got me excited about marine biology and interested in it was I've kept fish from a young age. So I kept fishing lots of different fish, freshwater fish, marine fish. And keeping those fish inspired me to sign up for marine biology. My mum always moans because when I went off to university, I kept the fish tanks, and then she'd ring me up in the middle of term saying there's been a problem with said fish. What am I going to do about it? So I'd have to explain to her down the phone what we were supposed to do about these fish that had a problem. So that's what got me into marine biology. And over the years of the research I've been doing, it's about making the place out there for my children and children's children a better place.
And has any of the research you've done subsequently been more complicated than trying to tell your mum how to clean a fish tank over the phone?
A little bit, but you would be surprised how complicated that is to explain things down the phone to my mum, but just generally to people. So lots of things more complicated, but fundamentally it's about looking after those organisms, looking after those habitats that have such an important role for us culturally, about well-being, but also all the services they provide.
Okay, so let's dig into some of this complex research that you're doing now. So Jo, back in 2020, we spoke to you for episode 9 of the Life Solved podcast, and you were talking about the work that's happening that you're involved with to restore the native oyster on the south coast of England. Mm-hmm. Since then, there have been a lot of developments. Can you fill us in on some of what's been happening?
Yes, of course, love to. So back then, most of our oysters were hanging in cages underneath marinas, pumping out, in the end, 9 billion larvae to the seabed. So which is really great. But what we wanted to do is put seabed populations back on the seabed. And since then, there's been a bylaw which closes areas to bottom-toed fishing, which means there's areas that are protected. And excitingly, since then, we've put in 2 seabed reefs, one in Langston Harbour, one in the Hamble River, just not so earlier this year. And excitingly, we've gone beyond just the oyster habitat. So last year we found out we've been successful in a $5 million grant over 5 years to restore oyster beds, seagrasses and salt marshes in the Solent in conjunction with oyster nesting, not oyster, I'm obsessed with oysters, in conjunction with seabird nesting sites, and to develop a co-design program to relieve some of the pressures. So that's really exciting. We've gone to what I'm calling a seascape restoration approach.
Right, oh, that's fantastic. So this is really expanding the work, and has that been driven by the success that can be seen from the oyster restoration?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we started in the oyster project, I'm involved in a whole community across Europe. There are 3 oyster restoration projects in Europe: us in the Solent, the one in Essex, and the one in Scotland, the Deep project. As a result of this sort of networks we formed between 2017 and now, there are 26 oyster restoration projects across Europe, going from sort of Sweden all the way down to the Mediterranean. So it's been a real expansion of this approach to actually actively help restore things that have been lost. And I think the success of that and the other partners working in salt marsh and seagrass, when we came together as a community, as a collaboration of 10 partners with all this expertise, we managed to secure this funding.
In terms of the Solent Seascape project, how does that compare for sort of scope and scale to other projects that are happening around the world?
Certainly in terms of Europe, it's one of the sort of the biggest and the first seascape restoration projects. So it's really exciting, and certainly is in the UK. Saying that, hot on our heels are a load of other projects happening around the UK, which is exactly what we need. And so I'm really excited about, and we need to learn from each other.
Yes. And is the sort of ambition of this on a scale that hasn't really been seen before? Yeah. As you were talking about, this is going from the sea all the way up to the salt marshes. So it's quite a range of different habitats.
Yep. Yeah. So we've got the subtidal oyster habitats, we've got the seagrass habitats that are in the sort of subtidal and intertidal, going up to the salt marsh, which is sort of higher intertidal, and then you've got the seabird nesting sites. And we're doing 8 hectares of salt marsh restoration habitat restored, 7 hectares of seagrass habitat actively restored, 4 hectares of oyster reefs, and then all these 10 seabird nesting sites. But we also want to restore and protect 30% of the Solent habitats and improve their condition through this Solent management plan as well. So it's really bold and really ambitious.
And are there, compared to when you started the oyster restoration, and as you said, you had to have those cages suspended to keep them safe because you didn't have that law in place to ensure that you could put them on the ground with confidence on the seabed. Are we in a different position with the Solent Seascape project, whereas laws have already been passed and you know that you can just go for it right away?
Well, the Solent, brilliantly, is a really well-protected system. And we have been working with the SIFCAs, which are the Inshore Fisheries Conservation Authorities, and all sorts of organisations across the Solent. And it was the SIFCA that put in this bylaw to have a ban on bottom-towed gear in areas of Langton Harbour, which enabled us to put the oyster reef there. And in the Hamble, the Port Authority has jurisdiction over what fishing occurs in that. So that's automatically then a no-take zone. So it's important that you restore in no-take zones. We hope eventually there'll be this fantastic tipping point reached when we have more oysters back in the Solent, and the protected areas, the oyster larvae, swim away and settle somewhere else.
Right.
This spillover impact will help support a sustainable fisheries in other area. But, it's we're quite unusual in the UK that we're still dredging for oysters. So when you go to Australia and America, they banned oyster dredging, and this is a bit contentious, around 20 years ago. So there's other ways of growing oysters, aren't there, Gordon?
Yes. So the stuff that I've been doing is looking at restorative aquaculture, so how we can grow something that's commercially valuable, like oysters or kelp, as well as making money out of that. You're also providing a series of services and supporting those other habitats as well. So if we can do those things alongside the restoration, we can make maximum use of those habitats and protect them for the value that they have intrinsically, but also for those commercially valuable species that come from them.
So this is sort of almost sustainable farming, but underwater.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It's aquaculture, but bivalves and kelp are probably the most sustainable things that you can culture in the sea. So if we can do that, they can provide lots of services plus the value of those products.
Yeah.
We can get double bonuses in the sense of restoration plus the aquaculture.
So what does that sort of work look like then? Are you coming up with kind of business models for?
We're not at that stage yet. What we've been doing is trialling those culture methods in places like the Solent. So we have a research platform that is moored in the middle of Langston Harbour. That's the university's platform, and we've been testing different ways to culture the oysters, but also the kelp, culturing them on ropes which are suspended below those platforms, and then seeing how they get on. Do they grow well? Do they survive? How much nutrient can they absorb, and how much carbon can they sequester as well? And those things are really important because we can then understand how much of a service they provide alongside that value.
Yeah. How much of a human hand do we want to be having in sustaining those cultures once they're established? Is the idea to find the optimum way of getting them to be self-sustaining, or is it actually about, cultivating in some respects the environment?
They are minimal input. The great thing is you place those baby kelp plants or the baby oysters or mussels out on your platform. You leave them to it because they soak up the nutrients, so they filter feed the plankton from the water, and then you go and harvest them. So apart from looking after them and making sure they're not being eaten by crabs and other things, it really is minimal effort, and that's why they're such a positive in terms of restorative aquaculture.
Gotcha. So it's about getting them re-established, and then once they're re-established, really the key thing is just to keep the damaging aspects of what people can do as far away as possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gotcha. If you're enjoying this episode of Life Solved, once it wraps up, why not check out a fascinating episode we did about how the illegal wildlife trade is getting its grubby little fingers into a trade in extinct animals. As the episode title suggests, ice ivory is the mammoth crime you should know about. And here at the University of Portsmouth, Dr. Caroline Cox and Dr. Luke Hauser are doing their bit to try and stop it. To find out how, search Life Solved wherever you listen to podcasts. So obviously the climate crisis is front and centre of a lot of people's minds right now. And we have here the challenge of habitat loss as well. Has that kind of very climate conscious thinking, do you think that's focused minds? Is that leading us to advances in this area that perhaps wouldn't have been available 10, 15 years ago? Yeah,
absolutely. But also the motivation that wasn't there 10, 15 years ago. I've been working in marine conservation for a long time, and people have never been more aware as they see what's happening in the world around us. And we've got this dual climate crisis, and we've got this huge planetary biodiversity loss. And the biodiversity loss is driven by often the removal of habitats. So in terms of they're completely intertwined. So if you think about the Solent Seascape project, so we've lost 70% of all our salt marshes since the 1870s, and UK-wide half of all our salt marsh. Seagrasses, we've lost between 44 and 92% of seagrass meadows across the UK in a similar period, probably around the 1930s actually. Oysters, across Europe, we've lost over 95% of all our oysters across Europe. And so these habitats, so the salt marsh and the seagrass, they're plants, they photosynthesize just like a forest, they draw down carbon. So we've lost the ability of these huge swathes of the coastal habitats to draw down carbon. And now we're trying to minimise the carbon in the atmosphere. We want to put these back. Oysters, they're an enabling environment. They might store carbon, but they're really about drawing down nutrients that can lead to eutrophication, but they're sort of the basis, like coral reefs, of biodiversity. So the things that grow in the oysters are lovely little bits of nibbly food for fish. And so oysters and seagrass beds provide a habitat that support fish stocks. And in fact, it's been estimated that the seagrass beds that used to exist around the UK that have now been lost would have supported 400 million more fish than we see in our waters now. Yes. So you get to see that because we lose this habitat, we lose the biodiversity, but we also lose the climate mitigating services they provide. And actually the latest IPCC climate report said that nature-based solutions, like putting habitat back or restoring it or improving its quality, could reach 30% of the targets we need to mitigate climate change by the Paris targets of 1.5 in 2030. So it's not pie in the sky. It's not rocket science. And so now people are thinking, right, we need to start doing this, and we need the money behind it. So people are more interested than ever because they're starting to realise what the natural world does for us.
Yes. And in terms of how these things are interconnected, so the oysters are filtering. They filter an extraordinary amount, don't they? I'm sure we talked about this in 2020. What's the number of litres that one oyster can filter in a day?
So it's around 200 litres a day. So that's around 16 pints an hour. But even by student standards, that's quite a lot.
Yes, it is. Yes, it's extraordinary. Yeah, maybe that's why they closed the student union in Portsmouth. We brought the oysters back, and there was no need for them. So the oysters are cleaning the sea, and then that helps in turn the kelp and the seagrass and so on to live in a healthy way and sequester more of that carbon, take more of that nitrogen.
Because as they just sit there like a pump, absorbing all the sort of phytoplankton, organic matter, and that sort of clarifies the water. So it reduces the amount of algae in the water. That increases the light penetration. The more light you get through to seagrass, which is a plant, the more it can photosynthesize and more it can grow. And so it's also the fact that the juvenile fish and the sort of medium-sized fish and the teenagers and adults want to use these different habitats at different stages of their life history. They might want to feed in one, hide in another, breed in another, put the young in another. So we need all these habitats to help support fish stocks, and that's really important. And so to reach this target via nature-based solutions, we've actually got this massive $484 billion funding gap, and we're only sort of funding a third of that at the moment. Gosh. So the more we understand the value of what these habitats provide, that opens up the possibility for new funding mechanisms to bring that money in. And we did some work on that in the Solent, didn't we, Gordon?
Yes, Jo. Yeah, Jo and I did some work a couple of years ago where we were looking at how valuable these habitats are to us as a society. So we looked at how, if we were to use catchment-sensitive farming techniques or build and use sewage treatment works, if we did that instead of supporting those habitats, how much would it cost? And we calculated or estimated it to be about £1 billion a year.
Gosh.
In terms of those services provided by those habitats present within the Solent. And those things, until recently, have gone unnoticed. They're not involved or part of the sort of economic assessment of things. They're not involved in business, in policy. And that's what's changed over the last few years. The valuation of those habitats in the Solent and beyond are now absolutely front and centre of the conversation. And that's where they should be, because once you value something, then you put a price on it, then you've got more vested interest to protect it.
So it's not just part of how we tackle a climate crisis, it's also going to have some impact on tackling an economic crisis.
Yes, absolutely. So if you don't have to spend £1 billion on building new sewage treatment works, you can use the habitats already there and make sure that they're doing as good a job as they can, then you've saved an awful lot of money. It's a bit of a no-brainer, really, in some ways.
Are there places in the world where the sort of the aquaculture is sufficiently advanced that it is having that sort of an impact, that you can already see these savings being made, or perhaps there's not been the need to build the infrastructure?
Well, the UK is a sort of odd, really, in some senses, in that it's behind the curve for a lot of aquaculture. We do a great job for salmonid aquaculture, so salmon up in the west coast of Scotland. But for other things, we really, compared to Europe and compared to Asia and the Far East, we are not generating much at all when it comes to aquaculture. So that global food security, the services that they provide through that process, plus the valuable product, is something we as a UK government could really invest in and then add to those services and make more of those coastal areas.
And green jobs. We need to create this circular economy, sustainable business, sustainable finance that creates green or blue jobs.
And as those traditional fisheries have fallen away because of overfishing and poor management, then if you can upskill those people back into aquaculture and other green jobs, as Jo says, then again that's a sort of levelling up agenda around those poorer coastal communities. It's fantastic from the economic point of view, fantastic from a social point of view, and from a habitat environment point of view.
Yeah, and the kind of applied science and research that we tend to do at the University of Portsmouth, you're not just scientists talking to scientists, are you? You're obviously out there having conversations with businesses, with people in politics. Is your sense that there is now just an understanding, there's a buy-in, if you like, to getting this done?
Yeah. There's huge buy-in, and what is reassuring for me, it's easy to be full of like gloom and doom when you read the newspapers, but working behind the scenes with economists, talking to people that are involved in policy, realising the ambitions of the UK and Europe in terms of our environmental plans, things are in the pipeline and there is a real step change. And now financiers are way ahead of the curve. Like fossil fuels are outdated now. They're not a good investment, and people going towards hopefully a more sustainable modus operandus in terms of how we value the goods provided by nature.
Thank you both for talking with me. It's often good in these Life Solved episodes to revisit a piece of research a few years down the line, as we've done today, to find out how much progress has been made and what the ambitions are for the future. If you'd like to listen to the full version of this episode or listen to our full conversation with Jo from back in 2020, head to the University of Portsmouth website, or you can download Life Solved on your favourite podcast app now. Next time, we will continue the green conversation, looking at batteries. As petrol and diesel-powered vehicles become increasingly unfashionable, we're all turning our attention to battery-powered vehicles. But as we scale that up, what's the environmental impact? We'll find out. Join us then.